Subscribe to our YouTube channel for in-depth interviews of India Inc. and press the bell icon so that you do not miss our updates.
Hello and welcome to Nirmal, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Hiral Dadia. We have with us Mr. R. Gopalan, former Secretary, Department of Economic Affairs and Department of Financial Services, joining in. Welcome to the show, Mr. Gopalan, and it's a pleasure to speak to you after a really long time.
Thanks, Hiral.
My first question coming to you is, firstly, let's talk about the GDP data that did come in, lastly. The kind of contraction that we've seen is the worst in history. And somewhere it is pretty much on the expected lines that a double-digit contraction was on the cards. However, since the last couple of months, if you have to talk about June, July, August, and now September, everyone is talking about green shoots that are being visible in terms of where a revival goes. What is your reading of this data that has come in?
Well, the fact that it is minus 23.9 and a minus 22.8 in the GVA really shows how deeply the first quarter of this fiscal year has been affected. That was expected because of the physical lockdown that has been imposed by the government for a variety of good reasons. And the issue that then arises is that how are we going to come out of this lockdown? Is the lockdown going? It's being phased out. Yes, there are any number of 4 times or 5 times the government has issued instructions for relaxation, but there are a lot of responsibilities put on the state governments on certain areas which are, containment zones. Obviously, there are issues, but in most of the other places, like when we move away from the cities, go into the districts, we find that the number is of people who are reported as a COVID positive is increasing. So the state governments are worried as to how to tackle this. You know very well, and I know very well, that the kind of health infrastructure available in those areas is not that good as compared to the cities. So the state governments are really worried, and there are a number of lockdowns coming in between. On Sunday lockdowns, a certain 1 week lockdown. So those kind of things are coming in, which disrupt the supply lines drastically. Now the problem is that already the demand is in some sense reduced thanks to the lack of incomes and those kind of issues. But if supply also get disrupted, obviously you are going to get the kind of comeback which we are planning to come to normalcy, that is going to get delayed. So my feeling is that, subject to the number of cases increasing, which is creating a bit of a uncertainty and a problem in the minds of people who want to spend, and as a result of this increase in numbers, if local governments are going to have supply disruptions instituted to contain this, these kind of numbers going up, obviously. Now, if that also happens, now the pace at which you expected normalcy to return is going to be delayed. So, which means the second quarter, if somebody was looking at a reasonable growth rate, yes, obviously compared to 23.9, yes, there certainly will be an improvement. But the question is that this is going to take away from the negative zone? No, certainly not. Right. And is it going to contribute to third and fourth quarters, coming back to normalcy? I would still say, from various people, from numbers, various models that have been worked out and given by people, I find that even in the fourth quarter also, some people say that we can have a positive growth rate thanks to the base effect of the previous fourth quarter. But I'm not so sure about that. And my view is that the entire this year, all the 4 quarters, we are going to have negative growth rates. And overall, the growth rate for FY21 could be anywhere between -10 to -15.
Right. So, if we are talking of negative growth rate, yes, that is expected to continue. So, what is it, according to you, that the government should be doing at this stage to revive the sentiments back to kickstart the Indian economy? Because, yes, we did see the first stimulus package that did come in. We did see that the RBI was also really proactive with regards to rate cuts as well as the other measures that they've taken in terms of infusing liquidity into the system goes. But apart from this, right now, in fact, a lot of conversations with government officials also indicate that now is the time when the government is actually looking to press the accelerator and not look behind. And the worst probably is going to be behind us. If that's what the government is looking to do, what, according to you, should be the measures that should be taken?
Okay, first you must create a confidence in the minds of people that, well, the economy is on its way back to the growth which we had in the past. Now, that confidence alone will enable people to spend money. Otherwise, they will hoard whatever savings they have got. They will hoard because they do not know how uncertain the future is going to be. So, government taking up a lot of, works in its own, the capital expenditure which it's supposed to do for the roads, making rural roads and other major, highways they are trying to look into. Uh, that is something which they got to do. And some amount of money is required to be put into the hands of people who are in very pretty bad shape or not been so far taken into account. For instance, the MSME, some restructuring is being done, but a large number of unorganized, enterprises are, almost, gone. And somewhere you would have read yesterday a report that about 30% of the eateries have permanently closed down.
Hmm.
Okay. Now, then you have got MSMEs, which only about 16% of the MSMEs in the country are registered or taking some amount of a bank facility they have got. The rest of them are all left to various, ways of money lending and those kind of things. How to ensure that these people are able to get enough cash to operate is something which we need to, which the government needs to, look at. Um, the restructuring which is now being the Kamath committee's restructuring is taking care of certain set of industries, but there again you don't find individual loans, the retail loans, the MSMEs, and those kind of areas have not been really looked into. That we will discuss later. But as far as the government is concerned, the best way to ensure that it's able to spend money at this point in time, because private investment has really dried up. Consumption, people are not really, they're hedging their bets. They're not able to go whole hog into consumption. There is some consumption going on, certainly. In two-wheelers, people want to travel instead of getting into buses and catching COVID. They want to go alone on their own. So two-wheeler sales have gone up. Some, automobile sales have really gone up. Yes, those are all good indications. But to what extent those growth rates, tractor sales have really gone up thanks to the agriculture operations showing good growth, thanks to Kharif and then the good rains in Kharif. No, those are all areas where some growth is, taking place. In the bulk of the rest of the economy, unless we are able to take some steps to ensure that demand gets picked up, the growth is going to be little tepid as we go along.
Right. So with this, as a country, if you go to see, at least in terms of other developed nations, you are seeing a lot of liquidity infusion, a lot of money printing that's happening. Taking that into consideration, do you think India has the fiscal as well as monetary space to boost demand from here on, if you have to consider the GDP to debt ratio?
Well, the as far as liquidity is concerned, even today we have got ample liquidity. Okay, now the close to about 3.7 to 3.8 lakh crores is totally the liquidity which is still available in the system. Now, state governments, I am told, has 1.8 lakh crores of money in the banking system unspent. Right. So, as far as liquidity is concerned, I think large amount, a good amount of steps have been taken really to provide liquidity in the system, which I would say is under the current circumstances, I would say it is not inadequate. Okay. Now, what really requires is the fiscal side, where the fiscal authorities have to see that the kind of demand, the kind of projects, investments, public investments to be made, which is a priority. Then looking at some amount of demand generation, especially taking into account the problems of industries, let us say the sector like sector-wise industries like which is now being probably looked at by the Kamath committee. Now, how to ensure that they retain their personnel? Is there anything which can be given by way of salary contribution, a percentage of salary to be paid so that they can retain people? Then looking at MSMEs who have a lot of fixed expenses to pay during this time, but no revenue, no turnover at all. For instance, electricity they are got to pay, they are got to keep their wages. I mean, so is there any way these kind of people can be compensated to ensure that they keep up the productive resources in action? They are available. So as soon as the demand really comes up, they will be in a position to um, generate that kind of production which is required for the demand to be met. If not, you have a problem because you will find demand picking up thanks to the liquidity being provided. Maybe liquidity may come up due to monetization also as we go along. That is also possible. So, but then the productive resources are not available. So, which means you will have inflation of a kind, which will be structural and it will take really some time to really pass off. So, I think all these things have to be calibrated by the government at this point in time. And I think to your question, as far as liquidity is concerned, yes, there is enough liquidity at this point in time for the purpose it requires. Maybe as we go along, when the credit growth, I mean, kind of grows, I mean, improves, which I think this year is not going to be so much, but as we go along, if as due to fiscal action, there is going to be some amount of liquidity that is required to be produced, or if fiscal action is going to be pretty high, uh, which may require some kind of a restraint by monetary action as we go along. That is also a possibility. But once again, all these things come in a balance, which as we go along, these things develop and actions appropriately are required to be taken.
Right. And then, as you mentioned as well, right now, the kind of support that is needed with MSMEs as well. Now, RBI has done their duty with regards to rate cuts. However, if you see in terms of the credit offtake, that has remained sluggish. Now, yes, we do understand that the bank credit is not picking up because there is some bit of risk averseness that is still there in the system. However, do you think there needs to be some bit of relaxation that needs to be done, by the RBI and as well, probably by the bankers themselves with regards to giving credit to MSMEs? Because right now what's happening is a lot of MSMEs that have been, offline speaking to have been telling us that new loans is something which is not going to them. Whereas the ones who already have a credit profile, they are seeing good top-ups that are happening. So there is credit offtake happening on one side, but majority of them who really not availed any loans, they are not able to take newer loans right now, and that's something which is becoming a hindrance. How do you think this problem should be dealt with? Because that's something which, I mean, and this is a sector which actually is providing employment at this hour right now.
Well, those MSMEs which are receiving loans at this point in time probably are those who have a good track record and whose business is, I mean, is surviving and doing reasonably well at this point in time.
All right.
So where the banks have the confidence that that particular MSME is capable of generating enough revenues and is able to be in a position to pay back the loan that has been given. the debt service coverage ratio is, good, more than one. Now, banks have a confidence that this is going to work and therefore they can lend more. But the banks are not able to clearly appreciate what is going to happen to the economy in various sectors in which MSME loans have been given. Now, that kind of an uncertainty can be overcome by the credit guarantee scheme which the government has, is implementing at this point in time. Though the pace that it is happening is, according to some people, is slow, but I can understand the problem that is there, because if the economy itself is not growing so well, and obviously credit guarantee is a fallback. It is not a primary driver for giving a loan. Okay, so if the MSME themselves are not able to get the proper revenue, sales, and profits, obviously the bank is little dissuaded from granting loans to such enterprises. Now, it's a the growth of the economy as it happens. That's ultimately probably that is the only what do you call the driver that can make the banks grant loans and increase the credit offtake. So unless we are able to focus on growth and ensure that, the kind of negative growth syndrome in which we are able to come out of it as fast as possible. Now, that is an indicator for the banks to be more confident in sanctioning loans to various industries.
Right. And taking this into consideration as well, another factor that everyone is probably saying that should be ignored right now is how inflation will pan out from here on. What is your stance on that front? And do you think a stronger rupee is something that could actually probably not be able to slay the inflation numbers?
Well, it's clearly that, when the rupee depreciates, obviously that contributes to inflation, because the prices of commodities do go up as a result, especially oil as a commodity. It certainly kind of goes up. But once again, the exporters are benefited by a depreciating rupee. So there is a fine balance has to be maintained there. And obviously, there are areas when the international situation, when a supply shock or some such thing, takes place outside, that has got an impact on the exchange rate. And our domestic, uh, growth of the economy, to the extent that, we are funding that through current account deficits, that also has a role on the exchange rate. So exchange rate is a function of number of issues that dominate the economy, and therefore, to say that, um, exchange rate can be a driver for growth, or can be a driver for any other macroeconomic, decisions making. Uh, Without associating itself with other influencing factors in the economy, that will not be, appropriate.
Right. And then again, in terms of where forex reserves are concerned as well, India's foreign currency reserves are now almost at an all-time high of $541 billion. Now, taking this into consideration, RBI also actually came out and said that the recent appreciation of the rupee is working towards containing imported inflationary pressures. Do you think a statement like this that has come in from the RBI is actually giving us a few questions whether the growing currency reserves is a sign of, say, a healthy external balance, and how would these reserves be deployed currently, and if India could actually more effectively deploy them to achieve growth and prosperity?
Well, the yeah, good amount of reserves gives a lot of confidence to the economy by way of the number of months of imports it covers is one aspect as well. But you also know very well that that's not a very efficient way of having, I mean, resources. If you have a good amount of, reserves as we have today, there is the return on that is not going to be good, because the return we get from deploying it outside is much less as compared to the liability we have in getting those reserves, increased or accreted into your account. So um, there were times when governors used to feel that, there is no need to increase reserves, and there have been governors who felt that, we need to increase the reserves based on the conditions under which the economy was at the time when these decisions were, really taken. Um, this thing is that, to see that um, the reserves, uh, the reserves also play another function. Um, Obviously, that affects the way the reserves, appreciate, or the increase. That also has a way of affecting the liquidity in the system as well. So it's a complex uh, interplay of various issues that determine the reserves, but but the confidence level as it gives to our, ability to pay our external debt is certainly one important aspect in the market understanding what the exchange rate has to be.
Right. And Gaurav, if you're talking growth as well, Mr. Gopalan, everyone's been, looking at how rural growth is panning out. And all of us know that the support that we're getting right now as well is coming from rural India. Urban, the growth is still slower. Do you think that's something which will continue? Because what's happening is that the remittances that are happening to rural India have been impacted. But with this, will agriculture as a sector be able to offset this impact to rural India as well? Or do you think rural India will continue to be a growth driver without any hindrances from here on?
Well, rural India has, as they say, as close to about, they contribute to close to about 45 to 50% of the GDP at this point in time. But agriculture is just about 14 to 15% of the GDP as far as Indian economy is concerned. Rural sector acts as a magnet for FMCG companies. Their growth it depends to large extent on the consumption in the rural areas, and a large number of industries are dependent on them, like tractors, uh, automobiles, two-wheelers. Those kind of industries are dependent to a large extent on the rural growth as well. But rural economy in its by itself will not be in a position to pull up the economic growth in the country. If manufacturing and services have a higher share in the GDP, and if they languish, any amount of growth in rural areas is not going to push up the growth in the country. And you will also understand that there is, as a result of this, there is a limitation on the rural growth rate pulling up the economy the way we think it should happen without agriculture and services, manufacturing and services contributing to the growth in the economy. Um, the important thing is that there is another aspect you have to look at, is that if there is good production in the agriculture, this year is going to be a very good production levels in in the economy. Now, when the consumption is not really going to be that much because we already have food grain reserves we have got, and there could be supply interdictions because of the COVID issue. Now, in both these, if you look at it, it can play a different role in the food grain prices
Right.
in the economy, and that can have an effect on the overall inflation as well. So that is the kind of interrelationship it has. But by itself, the rural economy cannot pull up the growth rate to the levels they were before COVID.
Right. So if we are looking at this kind of a scenario right now, and if the government has to take further measures, which sectors, according to you, will be growth drivers? I understand you mentioned about manufacturing and services as well. And to do this, if the government is providing any bit of financial support to any of the sectors, do you think then India needs to cut down some bit of their expenditure right now? And if they do that, which are the segments where the government could look at curtailing expenses to focus on revival of these sectors?
Okay, that's a good question. There's always been a dilemma in public finance. Um, Ideally, the fiscal experts would like to see that expenditure on infrastructure is increased.
Mm.
Okay, especially the capital expenditure, which includes infrastructure expenditure as well, is increased uh, by a wider margin as compared to revenue expenditure.
Mm.
And under the government budgetary system, there is a lot of stickiness in the revenue expenditure because of the salaries, the pension, the defense expenditure, interest payment. They're all little sticky. You will not be, and especially today under the current conflict, LAC issues, obviously defense expenditure is something we cannot uh, overlook. That's very, very, important in the country. So the certain things where the subsidies are areas where one should target, and obviously that number has come down, except on the food grain side, where the number is, pretty much there, thanks to our, food, right to food, policy. There is a lot of, subsidy being spent on that. But otherwise, my general feeling is that, one should also look at how to get the revenues raised in the country. Expenditure is one side, but how to raise the revenues. Today, the tax to GDP ratios are pretty low. COVID would certainly, lower it, understandably. But even before that, they were looking at about 10 and a half, 11 and a half maximum was the kind of central tax to GDP that was going on. Now, how do we ensure that the revenues are increased is a big issue. That's an area where government is focusing on, but the results seem to be a little slower than what one would expect that to be. So that portion of it also has to be tackled to see that, the resources available for you to spend are not affected by any of your wrong policies. Disinvestment is an area where we could get more money. Monetization of assets is another area. If it is, carefully crafted, you will be in a position to get, a good amount of money for this. But all these things are all have been discussed quite quite a good number of times. But somehow on the implementation side, we need to focus to ensure that we realize what we have in mind and what we plan to get.
Mm. Right. So, as you mentioned about monetization, as you mentioned about disinvestment as well, do you think we will be able to meet our FY21 disinvestment target? Or it's going to be a lot of effort that the government will have to take to look at that bit? And in terms of monetization as well, what, according to you, is the right timing to get a monetization with regards to where, if we talk about the fisc goes?
Well, on disinvestment, well, this is, one would say this is, um, uh, may not be a good time, but looking at how the stock markets and stock prices are, I don't see any reason why we should not step up our efforts to ensure that we are able to disinvest on the assets which we already have planned to do, uh, like your BPCL, like your LIC, and those kind of issues are something which we need to act little bit more speedily, and under normal times, I would have said that this target was achievable. But today, under the COVID conditions today, these targets are a challenge to achieve. And as far as monetization is concerned, land is always talked of as one asset which could be divested. There are reports about the kind of land bank available with PSUs which are going to be sold, which are going to be divested. And there are, land available with railways and these other ministries as well. Now, how to ensure that we are able to get a better value for the land is something which can be done. Fortunately, these lands will have no problem as far as a title is concerned. The clear title, because the government land, nobody will have any difficulty on the title, no conflict on the title will be there. So there will be uh, definitely an incentive for people to pick up these kinds of lands, especially for the low cost housing is one area which can be benefited by this kind of asset monetization, and that is something the government may have to focus on.
Right. And with this, Mr. Gopalan, if you talk about the banking sector as a whole as well, you have the private banks which are raising money left, right, and center right now. Public sector bank recap, do you think that's something which should be of utmost importance right now as well?
Very important, very important. Now, two things are there for the banks. First, look at the kind of provisioning they are going to make for the loans they have got. That requires capital. Okay. And growth of credit also requires capital.
Correct.
So, no time is more, important or more crucial than today for raising capital for the banks. You will find that, the public sector banks, the private sector banks are raising, capital. The public sector banks also have announced raising of capital. A number of banks, like Canara Bank, like State Bank, a lot of banks have indicated, Bank of Baroda, they have indicated how much they plan to raise, capital at this point in time. And um, what is the level to which the equity holding by the government in these public sector banks can go? 51% is fine, but then we get into the question of, can it not go down below that? 33%, should it not be an area of opportunity for government to kind of ensure that the banks are well capitalized instead of depending on the budgetary position? Can they not go to the market and raise the money?
Correct.
Now, today, markets are good. They can really raise the money. Now, the question that some people always raise is that, how do you think that by divesting, going below 51%, you will be in a position to ensure that the banks function more efficiently? There are issues in private sector banks which you are seeing at this point in time. So, how do you think that that will not get repeated in the public sector banks which are going to be divested? Some people say that, what will happen to various government related programs which government uses the public sector banks to work with? Now, how do you expect those programs to come about if the government holding goes down to 33%?
Correct.
Both have answers. One is the first one. There are proper governance systems which are there. The regulator has equal control. The same control over the PSBs as he has with the private sector banks. And you put in a structure where there is the holding companies there which can hold these banks, so that they are separated the um, the so-called influence from the government side. There are any number of steps. The PV Nayak committee has given a host of recommendations. They are what implementing, and obviously uh, that requires a political decision to take those kind of steps, and it should be taken in the right time. This is the right time to take those kind of decisions. So I have a feeling that the mix of things are there. As a last resort, obviously, it's not a welcome thing, because with the kind of debt paper floating around at this point in time, it may not be a good idea. Also, to add to capitalization of the banks through debt instruments, which government have done before. But the point remains that that's a very important area currently, thanks to the stressed assets which have come about because of COVID and other, economy not doing well. I think this is a good time to take a decision of a nature which is going to let the banks stand in good stead in the years to come.
Right. And then with this as well, when you're talking of the banks as well, what's happening is on the back of the moratorium that has been provided so far, the anticipation again is that there is probably going to be a higher stress level that could be coming in with regards to where the asset quality goes. But with this, the restructuring scheme that has been announced by the RBI as well, do you think it will help in that revival over there and help the banks tackle the stressed assets and NPA issues? Or do you think the requirement of a bad bank is also really urgent right now, given the current situation?
Well, you'll have to understand how these things work. Um, for instance, if you look at the bad bank has a moral hazard problem of now the banks can be little careless about the way they appraise projects before they sanction loans, because there is always a bad bank to take those bad loans back. That is a moral hazard problem. But today we have reached a stage, thanks to COVID and so many other problems, the kind of loans are such that even after restructuring, possibly you may end up with a certain number of loans which cannot even be rescued at this point in time. And there is no point in loading the banking system with those, with those bad assets, and you are not able to capitalize them the way they are required to be capitalized. And therefore, the best thing would be to go in for a bad bank. Maybe today's position with these kind of shocks which we have received, maybe this may be a good time to look at a bad bank. But once again, the temptation for a bad bank will be that, it is a one-stop kind of a thing, like the UTA assets issue, which was a one-stop kind of a situation which happened. No, that kind of a thing can be looked at, because of the COVID situation, which is enveloped and has made many of the loans highly problematic. As far as the Kamath Committee recommendation is concerned, they were good. Well, a number of people say that you are going to kick the can down the road, because after 2 years, how do you know if the economy is not going to grow the way we think it should grow? Obviously, some of those assets will continue to remain, will be stressed at that point in time. It is possible, but that is a call one needs to take today, because today's condition is so bad. Which, if you look at about of the loans to the industrial loans, and they're looking at if close to about 70% of them are stressed at this point in time, both due to COVID and then conditions before COVID. What do? We have to do some kind of a restructuring at this point in time to ensure that they are in a position to not to get worried about making payment to the banks at this point in time. Rather,